Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Russell Wald, Managing Director for Policy and Society with the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, HAI, or as others might say, HAI. I'm delighted to welcome you to HAI's annual AI boot camp for congressional staff. And over the last year, we've watched as the conversations about AI have moved from the laboratory to the conference room to the family dining table. AI is now firmly in the public consciousness, and at the same time, it has captivated and confounded policymakers. It should come as no surprise that the growing public interest in AI has created a surge in activity on Capitol Hill. In fact, just for this boot camp alone, we had a 40% increase in applications over the last year. For many in attendance, this session will be the beginning of our boot camp for you. However, for the 27 bipartisan congressional staff here, this represents the culmination of a nonstop engagement and intense instruction. On Monday, we started with the key fundamentals of AI, including foundation models, the risks and harms of AI, and the role of data. Yesterday, we focused on applied aspects of the technology and how it will impact healthcare, labor, and education. And just this morning, they participated in a simulation that forced them to question their trust in these systems. And now we arrive at our widely attended event, where we will discuss the role of industry and how it is shaping artificial intelligence. It is no secret that industry has overwhelming dominance in the current development of AI. However, academia has had a strong historical roots in AI advancement. In fact, a statistic from 2020 notes that over 82% of the algorithms in use today came from academic federally funded research. Yet, that gap has been growing exponentially, and just last year, according to the AI Index, there were 32 significant AI breakthroughs from industry, 3 from academia, and 0 from government. It is why HAI has engendered the idea of a national AI research resource, which will ultimately provide computational infrastructure and data sets for academic research in AI. However, this is why our discussion today is so important. This session will delve deep into this dynamic of power concentration of AI, confront the unique challenges the industry is facing, and explore a path towards a more balanced ecosystem that is pivotal for a vibrant innovation in human-centered AI. And with that, I'll begin our introductions. We'll start with Dr. Chloé Bakalar, who is the chief ethicist at Meta and an assistant professor at Temple University. Jack Clark is the co-founder of the AI safety and research company, Anthropic. He's also co-chair of the AI Index Steering Committee and a member of the National AI Advisory Committee. Heidi Roizen is a partner with Threshold Ventures with a long history in investing in leading Silicon Valley companies, including serving on the board of directors of Planet Labs. She's also a member of HAI's Advisory Council. Dr. Chris Manning is a professor of computer science, faculty associate director at HAI, and the director of the Stanford AI Lab. And our moderator this afternoon is Dr. Rob Reich, the McGregor-Durand Professor of Social Ethics of Science and Technology and a faculty associate director at HAI. Please help me welcome our panel.
All right, good evening, everybody. It's really great to have you here. I haven't been able to participate in the events that have preceded this, but I have myself spent a little bit of time in Washington, D.C. I've been trying to educate myself about the emerging policy space in AI, seen from, in some respect, your own shoes. Now you're out here on industry turf, as it were, here in Silicon Valley. And so with this distinguished group, what I wanted to do at the start of the conversation is offer a kind of framing that gives a back and forth. I'm going to aim that we not bore you. I'm going to try to provide constructive lines of conflict here on the stage. And I thought best to do that by framing a bunch of different positions. So here's position number one. Finally, after many years of slumber, with the EU in the lead, the United States has awakened to the significance of the artificial intelligence moment, and it's time for the policy window finally to be opening, and we see action in Washington, D.C. in a way that has always trailed behind the European Union and other places for the first time, especially in the past 9 months. The recent voluntary commitments that were announced, the promised executive order that's coming, Department of Commerce and NIST and OSTP, Department of Energy, the national security interests at stake, of course, all kinds of activity in Congress as well. And so the prying open of a policy window is now here to stay, and it's about time in some form or fashion, in part because Silicon Valley has long labored under a very peculiar delusion that products of every possible stripe in the United States, when they are distributed at reach-wide scale, are subject to various ordinary forms of regulatory safeguards. You buy a car, you have a variety of safety standards. You fly on an airplane, the same kind of thing happens. A radio, a television. You have a drug that you wish to take. You can't just, decide to set up a CRISPR lab in your garage and test your novel creation on your neighbor down the street and call it research. Milk and meat is inspected and is guaranteed in some form or fashion to be safer as a result of all of this. Why should technology, why should AI be any different? Technologists, for some reason, seem to think that they should be exempt from so many ordinary forms of regulatory safeguards. And the moment has come for them to be shown otherwise. That's position number one. Position number two. Yes, there's a little bit of a policy window opening in the United States, but we shouldn't really expect much from Washington, D.C. Why is that? Well, on the one hand, the voluntary commitments, somewhat toothless, the executive order that's coming, probably cosmetic, and then everyone's attention turns to the campaign. In the meantime, US interests are to maintain the innovation advantage that exists with American companies here in Silicon Valley, and so somehow regulating them into slowing down. They always have to worry about the but China kind of objection if we let others race ahead. And on top of it, the expertise, the technical expertise that would be required to advance wise and substantive policy, law, and regulation doesn't yet exist to a large extent in Washington, D.C. It happens to exist in companies. And so the bet that the techno-libertarian companies are making, suspicious as they've long been of DC regulation, is that basically it's a nothing burger happening this year in Washington. Attention turns to the campaign, and life proceeds as usual here in Silicon Valley. Perspective number three. Different than the internet moment, different than the social media moment, this AI moment is unique. Why? Because at the core of these companies, the scientists themselves who are responsible for the advances in artificial intelligence in these frontier companies, many of them are marked by an unusual kind of cultural, philosophical outlook. They're effective altruists, and they happen to be worried about existential risks to humanity. And this has been built into the core structure, the organizational culture of many of these frontier companies. The concerns at the frontier, which announced themselves from some of the statements that the leaders of the companies make, were concerned that AI could be runaway, rogue, self-replicating. It could create biopathogens that will destabilize the world. This could be an existential threat to humanity itself. The prior moments of social media did not include Mark Zuckerberg saying that newsfeed was going to be a risk to humanity. This moment is different because the people inside the companies closest to the technical frontier are profoundly concerned. And so if DC doesn't act, if the globe doesn't get coordinated on some governance mechanisms, there's going to be a strong desire from within some members of industry to push that forward. Fourth and final position. Whether or not it's DC, or whether it's not, it's the leaders who are effective altruists, long-termist, existential risk-oriented inside companies, here's a descriptive fact about AI. Unlike many other professions, unlike many other fields, computer science is a very young discipline. It only came into existence in the 1950s and 60s. AI and ML, the kind of research, the orientation that's behind these frontier models, the people who studied it only acquired power in the world in the past 20 or 30 years. Like in other fields, say law, or biomedical research, or even something as seemingly trivial or cosmetic as cosmetology, in which professional norms and community standards evolve over time. In AI, the field is developmentally immature when it comes to community standards, when it comes to not company gold stars for their good practices, but industry-wide practices that are genuinely shared. And so what the moment calls for, with uncertainty about formal law and regulation, is an acceleration towards genuine shared practices of responsible development among leading companies. Whether that will be led by EA actors or kind of forced by various forms of regulation in the EU or elsewhere is a separate question, but the moment calls for the leading practitioners and companies to assume the kind of ordinary perspective of taking responsibility for their extraordinarily powerful creations and trying to ensure that we shape the AI moment for human benefit, which it's certainly capable of providing, and steer away from great harm, which it can also do. All right, so I've given you 4 different perspectives. I want to offer each of you up a chance to just react. You can give me a totally new one. Am I framing it badly? Where do you fit yourself in? Chloe, let's start with you.
Well, I'm going to start by rejecting your premise on, I think framework 3, where tech companies are, the people at tech companies are all effective altruists, are all long-termists, are all these folks concerned with primarily existential threat. I mean, those are the loudest voices for sure, and plenty of companies have a lot of people in them taking that position. But that's not all of Silicon Valley, right? And that's not all of the big tech companies. I think you see that reflected in the many kinds of responsible AI or ethical AI teams that different tech companies have going, and the work that we're all currently doing to try and make better, safer, more robust, fairer, more equitable, et cetera, AI and Gen AI. That work is ongoing. It's never been perfect, and it will never be solved in the way that engineers like to solve it. But there are plenty of people doing it and not thinking just in terms like, oh, it's the end of the world and we all need to pack up shop and go home. So I think that's my first reaction, but there's
others,
a lot.
Sure.
I'll let more people
All right, Jack,
speak.
you work for perhaps the most effective altruist organization in town.
Thanks for complimenting our efficiency. I think I agree with number 3, but a much simpler interpretation, which is that people working in AI are aware that it's going to have a huge impact uncommonly quickly, and that a load of stuff needs to get built very quickly to make sure that the impacts are good. And I'll just give you one example from that. There was some good reporting in the Financial Times today about how Chinese companies are in aggregate buying about $5 billion worth of NVIDIA GPUs over this year and next year. That's the A800 chip, a chip designed by NVIDIA to evade US sanctions on its advanced chips. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because you can turn these chips into AI models which become commercial and strategic advantage. And they're doing that despite knowing it's going to exacerbate US-China trade tensions. So to them, spending all of this money to acquire these chips, which are going to be controlled, is worth something. That tells you that the value of this technology isn't hypothetical nor the impacts, and the technology plugs into much larger kind of political games being played between countries. So I think that you should maybe take technologists at their word, where they're looking at this stuff and saying, oh, this is going to have like a really huge impact and we should all deal with it. I think the existential risk stuff is probably overplayed and gets too many of the headlines, though we ourselves did research into sort of bioweapon design using this stuff and found that as you try and build like a generally useful scientific agent, you build a generally useful scientific agent, which can be used for almost anything, including some of these nastier things. So it's not hype. It might just be that the impacts are like large and coming soon, and technologists don't want to be the only ones responsible for that.
Mm-hmm. Chris.
Okay. Let me sort of counter a little what Jack just said.
Excellent.
I mean, on the one hand, you know, we have been in a period these last 5 or so years of extremely dramatic developments in AI. There really is just a marked change in what has been developed. And so that's exciting if you're in the field. But excitement also gives way very quickly to irrational exuberance. So for all that core congressional staff audience near the front, how many of you have read Alvin Toffler's Future Shock? One, okay. Notice that is one of the older people in the group. If actually the congressperson you work with is a boomer, maybe you should ask them if they have read it, and they probably have, because it was actually very influential in Congress, not least because Newt Gingrich was a huge fan of Alvin Toffler, and he prescribed as compulsory reading for any new fresh legislator. And so the book Future Shock was written when I was 5 years old in 1970. So I did not read it when it first came out. I wasn't that precocious. But this was 1970, and Alvin Toffler writes in it, "What is occurring now is in all likelihood bigger, deeper, and more important than the Industrial Revolution. A growing body of reputable opinion asserts that the present moment represents nothing less than the second great divide in human history, comparable in magnitude only with the shift from barbarism to civilization." Mm-hmm. Now, there was a bit of a moment at the end of the 60s. You've probably read about it in your high school history textbook, if nothing else. But, the world didn't change that much around 1970. And I think we should be careful not to fall into the same trap, right? Like, if you remember back a few years, when GPT-2 came out, not GPT-3 or GPT 3.5, ChatGPT-4, but GPT-2, the wise people, including the person on my right-hand side, deemed GPT-2 so dangerous that they could not release it. And there was a big hoopla about the great possibilities of danger and all the bad things that would happen. And now we're, whatever it is, 6 years later, and everyone can use GPT-2.
Or they can download Llama.
It's been a complete nothing burger. Nothing bad has happened to the world. And so I think we should keep some balance. So on the one hand, I think we should be thinking about the changes, and I am actually pro-regulation, but I also think we should keep that balance in mind.
Can I react very briefly? And this is great. This is why it's interesting. So for GPT-2, and I think you make great points about hubris, and of course the technology is going to change. Of course, some of what I said is going to be overstated. But GPT-2, we talked about worries about language models being used for disinformation, misinformation, spam, influence campaigns. Those things have all happened. They just happened several years later because GPT-2 was rubbish and wasn't good enough to effectuate those things. But the things that we predicted did end up happening just with subsequent generations of the technology. So we were 100% wrong on timelines and, probably were too keen about the immediate impacts. But you can get the timelines wrong, but they can still arrive some years later. And so I think it's worth bearing in mind that lots of these effects are going to arrive. We just don't quite know the timeline on which they are going to, but it could be sooner than we think. Yeah. Anyway.
All right, so Heidi, from the investor side of things here,
Okay, well, I'm just going to react to a few points you made very quickly. I don't like any of those ideas in total. I'm going to pluck pieces of them.
Good.
So the first thing I'm going to say is, due to the incredible nature of AI and what it can do, both good and bad, my belief is, like other things that have potential for existential threats, regulation is going to have to be global. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how the hell we're going to do that when we can't even agree in Washington what to do, nor do we have the expertise. And I'm glad you're all here. You guys are now the top of the... Do all of you feel qualified to go back and institute regulation at this point? Because I've been in tech for 40 years and I don't feel qualified. So just, with all due respect to all of us, there's a lot we don't know yet that we're going to have to figure out, and we're going to have to do it at a global level, and we don't necessarily humans don't seem to do that very well. The second point is relying on big corporations and startups to align with the benefit of humanity is an unrealistic viewpoint from the perspective of how those startups get funded. So for those of you who don't know how venture capital works, our money comes from things like teachers' unions, bus drivers' unions, university endowments. And when they give us their retirement funds, they do not say, please go save the world with this money. They say, go invest in companies that will, on average, deliver 20 to 25% IRR. that comes from all sorts of things. Sometimes they align well with the needs of humanity, like a company I'm on the board of, Planet Labs, I think is doing a lot of good. Sometimes, look at any of the human sins and how much the business models rely around that. Look at the business model of social media and the unintended consequence of the attention economy, right? The model, even if the entity could do well, the model that shareholders want to see, which is generating revenue, doesn't necessarily accrue to the benefit of humanity. So I think is really unrealistic. Now, do I think wonderful things are going to come from AI? Absolutely, and we're funding a lot of those things. We see pitches all the time about, curing cancer and doing all sorts of amazing things. We also see pitches about gambling and other, other things that maybe aren't so beneficial. So I'm just, let's see. Well, that was pretty depressing. I'll just stop
there. Good. All right. I want to talk now about two different approaches thinking about this from an industry and investor perspective that will intersect with regulatory questions. And that's one of the contrasts here on stage between Chloé at Meta, which is championing these powerful frontier models that are open source, and so not closed and proprietary. And then places like Anthropic or OpenAI that are much more concerned about letting anyone play with them. And it's not just for intellectual property reasons. The point is for some safety concerns. So let me, just to prime this debate and have Chloé and Jack say something, also Chris and Heidi if they wish. If I were trying to worry about the open meta model, the kind of thing would be, would you want to put nuclear materials in the hands of lots of people across the world and say, maybe some people will come up with nuclear energy and some people will come up with a nuclear bomb, but let's just go and find out. Why is open going to be compatible with safety? On the closed side, maybe there's some type of precautionary principle, a responsibility orientation that's built into it. So that's the initial input. Over to you, Chloé, since you represent the open part of this conversation.
I guess I'll have to be really open here. Yes. And also, I totally knew this was coming.
Yes.
So just, at least thinking about frontier models as the White House commitments have defined them, just to clarify.
Yes.
What Meta is working on are foundation models. They don't tend to meet the standard of frontier models. We still think that the White House commitments apply to the work that we're doing, but just that kind of, just so my comms people don't kill me later.
Yes.
Yeah. But so we want safe and robust and fair and transparent AI.
AI, yes.
And we think that open science, open innovation, these are the ways that get us there. So it's not between openness and safety. It's different approaches towards how we get safety and how we get better innovation. There's always going to be, with any tool, with any technology, there's going to be opportunity for bad actors and good actors, for bad uses and good uses. But in terms of the good uses, we feel like these outweigh the risks of the bad uses, given the numbers of safeguards and guardrails, like our responsible use guidelines that were released along with Llama 2 for commercial use, along with fine-tuning and our extensive red teaming efforts, that we've done the work to try and make these open to the public models as safe and as carefully constrained as possible, while still enabling as much innovation as possible, knowing that through that we get safer products, we get the wisdom, the knowledge, the experience of not just the people who work at Meta, but everybody who can teach us something about how to make our models better, about coming up with different uses, finding vulnerabilities, finding biases, telling us what we can address to make these things better, and also going off and doing good things. We aren't just coming up with this out of nowhere. This isn't an empty principle for us. We have many years of experience leading the way in open source. And from our experience, that is the bulk of what's happened. We've gained so much value from opening up our systems so that people can experiment with them, and teaching us a great deal in the process. And this is part of how the United States manages to stay really competitive in this space too. We're able to leverage the collective wisdom of all of our people, not just those who happen to work within big tech companies. And we believe very strongly that AI should benefit all people, all society, not just a few, fancy, big, expensive tech companies. And then I'll be ready to retort.
All right, Jack.
I won't speak for Chloe. I will say that this whole thing is really confusing, and I don't think that there are clear, correct answers here. I'm glad that there are multiple companies doing very different bets, because we get a lot of evidence that way, which we can learn from. It's a really hard space. At Anthropic the other day, I was talking to a colleague about how we've done compartmentalization internally on some of our wackier parts of research, and they said, well, the annoying thing about that is when I started here, I went and improved some part of our tech stack. And if the compartmentalization had been in place, I wouldn't have been able to do that, because I randomly drove by, saw a thing, and worked on it. And that illustrates Chloe's point. If you close stuff off, you have costs, and you have costs on random innovation, which is really, really important. So why would you close anything off? And I think a reason that we're doing it is that we don't fully understand the full capabilities of these models. So we don't fully understand all of the positive uses of them, but we really don't understand all of the potential negative uses of them. And additionally, if you release the weights of a model, you have zero control over what subsequently happens with it. So we might just occupy the more paranoid end of the spectrum, where we're looking at these models and we're like, oh, I don't know that we really know how to look at this stuff, so we're going to be cautionary. I think the greatest cost of this would be getting into some binary debate about open versus closed, because in reality, I think everyone's confused and is basically trying to work out what the appropriate level is, so that when we talk to policymakers in the coming years, we have evidence. Because Llama 2 might lead to loads of wonderful things, and that's going to help evidence on that side, or maybe it doesn't, and that will provide evidence to the other side. And I'm not wishing that. I'm just saying it's going to help create that. The reason you want to do this in the long run is that if these things are really as impactful as the possibly hubristic and overly confident people working on them are convinced of, then you don't want to fully open them. But as I just sort of gestured at, we could be wildly wrong about this, and this could not be a useful exercise.
Can I want to reiterate something that you said to start, which is that these are two different approaches. It's not a binary, right? Yeah. There's a whole spectrum of options between fully open and fully closed. We are not fully open at Meta, obviously, and very few places are fully closed, at least the for-profit world. But that's part of the benefit of this period, is that we're getting to experiment with these different models, and we don't know yet which is best. We're learning as we go. And we're trying to have as much humility as is possible and appropriate in this space, knowing that there are so many known unknowns and then potentially infinite unknowns. So I really liked what you said there.
Chris, I know you have a perspective on this too. So do you view openness as mainly in sync with and support of safety, or mainly in tension with safety?
So I would agree with Jack that the situation is very complex and it's hard to know where to position things, and the world seems to be becoming more complex rather than simpler to make a judgment. But overall, I guess I really want to support the Meta viewpoint that you've just heard from Chloe. Now, Meta is not a perfect company. There have been some congressional hearings on this topic. But on this issue of encouraging greater scientific and engineering openness in the space of foundation models, I think that Meta is just having a hugely beneficial effect, and is sort of really also then sort of copying the fact that they're getting a lot of blowback from the fact that they're being open when other companies aren't, even though I suspect a lot of those companies aren't being open for commercial advantage, not the noble reasons that they're claiming. That what we would like to do is drive broad innovation across the whole American and even more broadly across the globe economy. And that broad innovation is driven by the broad dissemination of knowledge. Now, some of that broad dissemination of knowledge is done by universities, so we work very actively at that. But some of it is also done in the modern software world by work done at companies that is made openly available. And so it's this open innovation that then allows other companies to innovate. I guess I was just recently listening to a podcast by the people at Bloomberg who did Bloomberg GPT. And they were saying exactly what you might expect, right? Well, at the time we got started, there's really only been 2 efforts on large language models in the open, the earlier efforts at Meta and the efforts, the Bloom model that was led by Hugging Face. We studied those really carefully and got out all the information we could to undergird our efforts. And the idea that this country will be better off by secreting away all this knowledge in a couple of tiny companies rather than broadly disseminating it across the economy, I think is really wrong and really questionable.
Yeah, can I just,
yes,
add one more point to all of that is competition is good. If you look at the history of technology we've always had, whether it's Windows or the Mac OS or iOS or Android or this or that or whatever, Beta versus VHS if you want to go way back. Having a competitive race is good. This stuff is so expensive that only the biggest companies can do it, right? And yet, when you think about any other ecosystem, I mean, you're all carrying around probably 100 apps you paid for in some form from 100 different vendors that aren't whoever provided you your phone. Even if they're taking 30% off the top, still, other companies in ecosystems get built in order to turn these platforms into utility. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think, something, and again, I think something like Meta that is allowing this to happen, I think it's a good thing for the kind of companies that funds like mine invest in, because it allows the progress to happen without being able to afford the incredible cost of that. Yeah. I do worry about the issue, so I'm kind of trying, I don't know where the balance is, because if bad actors are, it's not like we should assume everyone has good intent. We actually know that some people don't have good intent. And so it's very hard to weed out the ones who don't have good intent from the ones who do. Yeah. And I don't know how we do that.
There's no risk-free option, right? There's no way to completely eliminate risk. We can mitigate against some of it, but that's the best we can do unless we all throw up our hands and start over in a new Stone Age.
All right, I've got one small final question before I turn it over to you for your questions. Heidi, you mentioned something important right at the tail end there about how capital intensive, how costly it is to build one of these frontier models. So open in that respect also helps, because actually constructing one of these is hugely costly. The panel's topic or subject is the role that industry can play itself in trying to shape a responsible, ethical, the benefits rather than the harms. I want to ask about how it is that we think the entities outside the companies can or should play a role. And of course, I have in some form or fashion here universities in mind, but it could also be civil society, nonprofit organizations. But leaving aside the venture capital investment structure for these frontier model companies, and the desire to have science proceed in the way that we've been talking about, what can industry do, what can government do to get more actors into the space to provide the compute that's necessary for non-company members or employees to play a role here? How do you think about this question about more players in the space given the compute-intensive needs for being on the frontier? Jack.
Two things. One thing is, this conversation is partly confusing because there isn't like a public option for really advanced AI models, and we've supported the National AI Research Resource because we basically think there should be a publicly funded effort to build AI models that are very, very powerful using lots of computers in the public interest and get the sort of open knowledge that Chris talked about. And the second thing is, as a company, one thing that we know that we don't know is we don't fully understand all the capabilities of these models, and we're constantly trying to buy third-party testing or work with third parties to test and evaluate our models. And there's a whole ecosystem of testing to be built out, partly catalyzed by things that the White House is asking us to do, but partly because we ourselves would rather pay entities outside ourselves to characterize our models than to entirely do it in-house. So there's like a market option there as well as a policy option.
Yeah, completely agree on that point. This seems like one of the most important areas where we need to have strong collaboration with civil society, with government, with academia, and with the companies, right, with these corporations, trying to figure out the best ways to evaluate. We do lots of evaluation on our own. That is not sufficient, right? And we need to come up with some sort of ideally standardized or best practices that are industry-wide so that those evaluations mean something and can be compared to one another. I'd also say that there are certain areas that are so incredibly tricky right now that we're hoping that we can build up these kinds of relationships so we can work on them together. An example that comes up a lot at Meta is identifying third-party AI-generated content, right? This is going to be especially important when we're talking about elections, right? Some of this stuff is potentially silly, but a lot of it is critical, and it's hard to do. The big companies can agree on watermarking, as we've agreed to do with the White House commitments. We can agree on certain handshakes, and that makes it really easy to identify AI-generated content that comes from good actors, or at least large-scale industry actors. It means that it's very difficult still to identify third-party content that's made by bad actors for bad reasons, so exactly the kind that we'd want to target. And this is the kind of challenge where we need more minds, more perspectives. It might not be a solvable problem, but it might be, but not on our own.
Chris or Heidi, last thought or word on this?
Yeah, so the way to get more minds focused on the future is for there to be good resources and funding at universities. I mean, that is both how we educate hundreds and thousands of new technologists in the latest techniques, but also where the cutting edge new ideas come. I mean, there's this idea that's at the moment that because of the scale of these huge models like GPT-4 or Anthropic's Claude, where people are already spending 100 million plus on the models, and the next generation is going to be 1 billion plus heading up, right? That's a world in which academia is irrelevant. But I think that's just completely not true. That when you look at the, coming up with new ideas is hard, but it's usually done by creative young people in rigorous thinking contexts like universities. And if you look at the origins of all the exciting ideas that are sort of being deployed at the moment, they come back to academia, just about the majority of them. So, the idea of attention, that is the central idea of transformers, invented in academia. The idea of diffusion models, which powers all of those current generation image models like Midjourney and version 5 and stuff you see, invented in academia, actually at Stanford. And for new advances that are happening now, that sort of just a year ago that a few grad students at Stanford had this ideas about how you could do low-cost instruction fine-tuning of models, so you didn't have to be at OpenAI scale to have an instruction fine-tuned model that could produce something like ChatGPT, and demonstrated with Stanford Alpaca you could do it for a few $1,000. And that sort of led to this sort of open source and small company, dynamo that there was then, that other companies like Mosaic and Databricks, that they're all building Mosaic ML and Databricks Dolly, and other people more in the open, like the open collectives like Vicuña, right? There was suddenly this huge outpouring of an ecosystem of middle-sized models. And so that's the kind of thing that we'd like to have happen. And for that to happen, academia doesn't need $1 billion, but academia does need to have enough resources that we can play in the same field. And so that's where ideas like the NAIR, the National AI Research Resource, is really important. That's realizing that, traditionally fields like physics or biology have had huge amounts of government funding. We are now in an age where giving a CS PhD student a laptop isn't sufficient anymore, and we do actually have to have some more serious funding, but that doesn't mean we need $1 billion.
And I'll just make one plea. The government's a big buyer of a lot of things that are really important to us right now. And two of them to me are defense and cyber, which obviously are related, but they are, protecting us from different sorts of things. And I would really hope that somehow we can get government to be on the leading edge of collaborating with academia, with industry, with all of this, as opposed to the trailing edge. And sometimes for some of my companies that work with the government, it feels like we have to be at the trailing edge because procurement's so hard. But some of that's loosening up, and we have some really excellent relationships with government across some of these companies, both large and small. And I would just encourage all of you to think about that, because if you wait for it to be obvious until you get into this, I think it's going to be too late.
All
Just
right.
end on a happy note.
I think it's time to open the floor to questions. We'll take some questions here, and there's microphones going around. Haifa, why don't you just choose whoever you like, and if you could just say your name, that'd be great as you ask a question.
Thanks, everybody. Great to see some of you again. And thank you for joining this educational experience. It's important for our country. So I want to bring a civil society perspective that's a lot more risk-based. I understand that for academia, it's more about sharing knowledge, but it's the end of the day, so we can get a little bit feisty. Nothing is risk-free, and there's a spectrum, but there's also a spectrum for responsibility. Companies need to be responsible. Companies might have fine-tuned their models with extra guardrails, but correct me if I'm wrong, and I would love to be, but when it's open source and you essentially have unsecured model weights that anybody can use, some of those guardrails could be stripped away, the guardrails that protect against the toxicity, so you end up more with the base model, which reflects our really toxic internet data. And people, users, often don't follow responsible use guidelines. Companies often don't even follow their ethical principles. So for example, Microsoft, which had published really strong ethical principles, even though they tested their chatbot being in Southeast Asia and saw a lot of problems with the chat, they still released their model, even though it went against their ethical principles in several ways because of competitive market pressure. And this is where I think we need regulation to set the playing field. And in terms of open source software, I can see how it's been useful in the past, although not in all cases, right? Even in blockchain, the argument is like, let's do community improvement. But a lot of programs, even if white hat actors try to improve them, just get left abandoned, right? So what's different with AI compared to past technologies? AI has amplifying effects. The speed and scale of adoption is very rapid. We don't know how to control the technologies. When they're open source, the companies don't have control. Often the engineers don't even know how their models work or what the goals are.
Do you have a question for the panel?
Yeah. What can we give for the policy side? Is there a policy approach that addresses open source in a different way?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm the right person to design a policy approach for open source. I think probably these folks in front of me might be better suited to that. But I do think, it's a space where we could all use some guidance, right? And so part of industry's job here, part of Meta's job here is to share what we learn through this experience, the data that we collect. We're confident that overall, open sourcing Llama 2 for commercial use, that this is based on our long history of experience open sourcing, is going to be beneficial for society. It's going to lead to more safety And yes, there will be bad uses, bad actors, as I said before, but overall, we're confident in this approach as a way of getting safer models, getting a safer system, opening it up to people who will find the things that can be improved and need to be improved. But we're also very open to conversations like this with people from government, from civil society, from academia about how to do that in the best possible way. We've been very thoughtful and deliberate in our approach on this release. We didn't just throw it out there. It may be that we learn that the responsible use guidelines are not picked up and adopted in the way that we would hope, although right now evidence is stacking in the opposite direction. People are saying, at least, they're finding it quite helpful, and we're seeing that reflected in the data that we're getting back. And fine-tuning helps mitigate against some of that risk. The red teaming efforts, which are not just internal, but we bring in lots of people externally to help future-proof and help identify and help improve our models. I think over 350 people in the last couple of months have come in to help us do all of that. So we're doing what we can. We're learning as we go. We're going to improve and keep evolving based on those evidence-based learnings. But yeah, it's very much a conversation that needs to happen with all of these other actors in the room, too.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of uncertainty with the development of these technologies in questions like intellectual property, trust and safety, liability. How are you all as industry navigating those questions, and how do you think that uncertainty or the potential that they could be resolved will impact the direction that your companies go?
I think that there's a huge amount of space to color in here, which makes everyone in industry quite nervous. You would much prefer there to be, best practices for questions of intellectual property and best practices for things like trust and safety. I think most people are just trying to, design processes that you can kind of document that feel like responsible and feel like they meet the challenges that you encounter when you're deploying these things in the wild, and are talking to stakeholders in government about it. But what we'd really benefit from is things like, the reason I like the National AI Research Resource is I'd love for there to be a public prototype of a foundation model, or the sorts of models that we're all thinking about, that is done fully in the open and kind of federally funded, because then you have to work on all of these questions together in real time, rather than just having industry kind of work on pushing the policy window forward on them, which feels a bit more awkward and harder to get to the truth about. Good question. Happy to chat after as well.
I think we have one back there, yeah?
Yeah. Hello, my name is Halina. I'm not a staffer. I'm a member of parliament, although a member of parliament of Ukraine, visiting Stanford. What we see here in US overall is that there is a very progressive private sector in digital technologies, AI and stuff like that, but government does not use that much digital technologies to communicate and provide services to citizens and business and stuff like that. In Ukraine, it's vice versa. Currently, Ukraine is the most digital advanced country in Europe, and that what pretty much helped us to survive and go through the most hardest nightmare which we faced in Ukraine because of unprovoked Russian aggression. So there was a lot of discussion about regulations, where there should be some regulations in US, in Ukraine, and stuff like that. So I want to ask you, what do you think about regulations? Do you feel you need it? And what kind of regulations, if you do feel you need it? Thank you.
Look, reasonable, technologically informed, timely regulation that creates standards that everybody can follow and are clear, consistent. I mean, these are good things, right? They help us ensure that we're engaging in responsible AI, responsible development, innovation, all of that. Part of the challenge here is that the technology moves at a pace, as you guys all know, that is very different from the pace that regulation moves at. So it might be that we need more of these lightweight models of regulatory involvement, and that's one way to try and get industry alignment on norms and standards like these White House commitments. But I mean, we're not anti-regulation at all. In many ways, it empowers us to do the kind of work that we want to do. It removes some levels of confusion about what's expected, and that can help really spur innovation in a responsible way. I'm curious what you think.
And some regulations can be really helpful if they're connected to a test that you can run. You know, we qualify, you know, cars and planes because they pass certain tests for how they behave, so that we know that they'll fly effectively or drive effectively. I think for AI, we ultimately need more of those, especially in domains like medicine, where there's lots of ambiguity about whether it's appropriate to deploy something. If we had tests, we could deploy more of this stuff into the economy faster, because it would take out a lot of the ambiguity.
Question in the front.
Hey there. So we don't know all the threats that will come from large language models and AI in general, but we did learn that there is a major threat of disinformation and misinformation. We got a presentation that text models from GPT-3 were very effective in pushing misinformation and disinformation. Now we're in a whole new era where you have image generation too. So I'm curious of what you think industry should do ahead of the 2024 election with these AI systems out there. Yeah. And also I'm curious, with an open source model, when you're giving out the weights, is there a way to take a downstream tool off the table once it's already been out there?
Maybe I'll jump on this.
Can I just, actually, I wanted to amplify one additional element about the concern about the 2024 election,
yeah.
Because I think in addition to what you just described as a kind of present concern, misinformation, disinformation in the election space, many people believe, Casey Newton, who writes the newsletter, The Platformer, says we've reached peak trust and safety within the social media companies. And so the teams that were responsible in the 2020 election to try to stay on top of election integrity have been pared back or eliminated. And so the distribution mechanisms now are going to be more open than they were in the past. And so the AI moment, coupled with past peak and trust and safety, makes this a messier 2024 election than 2020.
I was about to talk about our trust and safety work. So. But I think you make a good point, which is that you're going to need to have to know what to look for. I mean, we were talking about it today with a colleague where, as an example, and I'm not saying we'll do this, but it's an initial project we're working on. What if you could kind of classify, if you had people trying to look for like election rigging or features that look like election rigging in text that they're trying to generate or solicit? Would that be the kind of thing that gives you clues that there are bad actors trying to generate misinformation on your platform? And that maybe illustrates some of the kind of trust and safety and monitoring challenge here is, as a company, you're going to need to know what to look for and know what signs are of actors trying to repurpose your stuff for bad things. And then those are going to be the simple terms you can think of. They will help you find the terms which you haven't thought of, which people are actually using in the wild, because you're in this cat and mouse game with people trying to subvert your platform. So I think a lot of it's going to look at like that, which is just sort of meat and potatoes, instrumentation, enforcement, being able to respond rapidly. And then an additional layer, we'll be talking with members of government about what we should be looking for. In the same way that tech companies get briefings from FBI field offices on security threats or what have you, I think we could probably get some briefings on electoral threats or misinformation, although it's obviously a more fraught and innately political area. But those are some of the ways we're thinking about it.
Yeah. I mean, I can say that we've taken misinfo, disinfo, manipulated media very seriously for a very long time. We are actively prioritizing and investing in this specifically for the Gen AI context and 2024 elections, not just in the United States. But this is one of our top priorities as a company, to try and understand the potential risks that might be new or might be more that might express themselves in somewhat different ways that Gen AI brings to the equation, and are committed to doing that work, trying to promote as much safety and minimize as many integrity risks as possible. And yeah, it's going to be, as Jack said, necessarily a conversation back and forth about what we're finding and what you guys are worrying about, or what you think we should be looking for.
Can I go with Colin? So I do actually think that misinformation, disinformation is a really scary thing. And well, it's easily and fairly cheaply created by human beings as well. But clearly in this new world of generative AI, the costs are coming down further orders of magnitude. But I think the way either kind of disinformation is going to be kept under control is by limiting its distribution. The distribution is the choke point. And so from the perspective of limiting distribution, there has to be regulation, real teeth, consequences to distribution channels that are widely distributing misinformation, disinformation. And so I think this is precisely where Section 230 should be rethought, because at the moment there are no consequences for distributing disinformation.
Let's take a final question, and then dinner is in front of us.
Oh, actually, could I just follow really quickly, because I know Tara Lyons is somewhere here. This is one of the areas also where these sorts of bodies that bring together all of these different actors have been investing in, so that we can help develop industry standards. So the manipulated media work that I know Meta's involved in, and a number of the other big companies, Microsoft, to try and figure out plans not just for election, but also relevant to election. So we're already doing a lot of this intra-industry collaboration to try and protect this space especially.
All right, final question.
To your last point, kind of talking about Section 230 and how that might not, in your view, translate over to the AI context. Let's say that foundational models are being used by downstream software companies that are being used to produce software. The idea of Section 230 is that a small business would still be able to deal with the liability concerns that come with the exigencies of speech online. If we're feeding foundational models data sets that come from online content that is the same problem that creates the 230's liability issues in the first place, why would it serve our purposes not to apply 230 as is to foundational models to ensure smaller businesses could access the space? Because if we pull away 230, the only people who could withstand the liability would be Meta.
So what to do about how to reform things is a very complex issue, and I don't think I necessarily have all of it worked out. But just to throw out one suggestion, right? Section 230 was constructed in the era of dial-up bulletin board systems, and there were lots of little people that had their little bulletin board with 100 users, and yeah, it seemed unreasonable to expect them to be liable for everything that's posted. We're now in this very different world where we have huge social networks with hundreds of millions of users and very large companies. I mean, I actually think a reasonable starting point would be to put a size threshold on it, right? That if you have content that is going to be seen by less than 100,000 people, let's say, whatever, you don't have to worry about it. But if given that social media companies control the algorithms and therefore have a lot of influence on what content is seen how many times, if it is going to be the case that, over 100,000, or we could even say over 1 million if you wish, people are going to be shown certain content, then maybe having made that editorial decision as to which content to promote, it's reasonable that you should be taking responsibility for having checked that it's reasonable content.
All right, I'm going to turn the floor back to Russell Wald, who can give us final instructions. And in the meantime, would you join me in thanking our panelists? And thank you.